Hello Escanaba families, this is Kobe Fletcher and I want to run through the presentation that I made to the board on Monday night about reconfiguration. This is a long presentation, I'll tell you that right now, but if you were unable to attend the board meeting and you have questions, I hope you will listen along and follow through to the end, and it's likely, I hope anyway, that I'll be able to answer all your questions for you. I framed the discussion that we had around three questions that I wanted to answer. The first is whether or not there is a need to consolidate. If there's no need to consolidate, then there's really no need to continue that discussion. But we need to determine whether or not there's a need. And then we have to ask ourselves whether or not we can provide the same level of programming and service in fewer buildings. If we can, then that tells us how we can consolidate. And then finally, we have to ask ourselves whether or not we should consolidate, and if so, what should we do and when should we do it? So I'm going to try to answer all three of those questions for you as we go through this slideshow. I'm going to start with the overall context, and I'm going to talk a little bit about school funding and population in Michigan. My first point is that there is very strong evidence for underfunding of education in Michigan. And I will probably sound like a broken record as I go through this, but it's important that I make the case for underfunding because it contributes to the consolidation discussion. So I want to go through two studies, the first by the School Finance Research Collaborative. And this was a group made up of many constituents, quite a few of them businesses, many of them communities, community organizations, and schools. And they got together and they said, you know, we really need to know what funding should be for schools in order for them to meet the standards that the state of Michigan has set for educating kids. We want talent coming into the state, and good education is a foundation for that. So they commissioned the nation's two top school funding research firms and said, hey, will you work together and let us know what funding should look like in Michigan for us to do what we want to do? And they came up with a base per pupil funding amount of $9,590. Currently, we receive $8,111 per pupil. That represents an increase, and we're grateful for that. But you'll see that even with that increase, we fall far below what our base per pupil funding should be to give quality education to kids in Michigan. In addition to that, they recommended providing a little over $14,000 per pupil to fund preschools. A lot of you have heard talk of the third grade reading law. This is the law that says if a kid doesn't read at grade level by third grade, then they have to be held back. I get the feeling behind that, but most of us that have been in education for a while and are familiar with the research know that if you want a kid to read by third grade, you have to have preschool. You have to start with kids that young. And so they're saying that if that's important to the state needs to pony up and forget about Band-Aids and do something meaningful so that kids are able to read by third grade. They also recommended that additional funding, weighted funding, be provided for special education, at-risk, English language learners, and career and technology education students. And they provided that information as a percentage of the base per pupil funding. So for example, they said special education students should be funded at twice the base. So $9,590 times 2 for every special education student. We're happy to provide those services, but it is very expensive to educate a student who served in special education. And between the state and federal governments, we're only reimbursed about 28% of our costs. They recommend that those costs be completely reimbursed. Half again the base amount for an at-risk student, for example. So $9,590 and another half of that. So weighted cost for students who come to us with more needs. And then $731 per rider to fund transportation. We don't receive any funding from the state to provide transportation. So if you're a district like us and you cover a fairly decent area and you're sending buses out all over the place, those transportation costs can add up, and some funding for that would be nice. In addition to that, there was a study completed by Dr. David Arson from Michigan State University, and he is the foremost expert on school funding in Michigan. He is the go-to person if you want to know about it. And his group confirmed the findings of the School Finance Research Collaborative Studies. And I've added a quote here because I think it speaks volumes. Their report says Michigan ranks dead last among states in total education revenue growth since the passage of Proposal A. And that is not a category in which we want to be dead last. In addition to that, they pointed out something that rubs a lot of us the wrong way. The school aid fund is not just used for public schools. So we hear our legislators frequently say that the school aid fund is larger than it's ever been before. And that's very true, but that's before they turn around and take money out of it for things like community colleges and universities. And the funding they take out every year amounts to about $850 per pupil, and that's a significant amount of money. So the bottom line, I think, is that we can state pretty confidently that schools in Michigan are underfunded. There's another aspect to this, however. Many people think that the money we receive from the state is also supposed to cover buildings and things like that, so our capital needs. And the truth is that it's not. Proposal A explicitly left the funding of capital and facility needs to the local community. They basically said, yeah, we'll give you money for the instructional program, but if you want more than that, you get to pay for it yourselves. And so bond proposals are commonly used if we want to fund major capital projects. I think most people know what that is. Sinking funds are being used more and more for some of the smaller repairs and upgrades to be done so that districts don't raid money that they would otherwise be spending on classrooms in order to pay for those things. Roughly 40% of the school districts in the state have sinking funds, with more and more coming on board every year. They tend to be fairly successful downstate, less so in the Upper Peninsula where folks have been a little more tax averse. And I get that. You know, we had two sinking fund proposals and they were both voted down, and that's why you put it out to the voters so they can have their say. Then there's a third aspect here that's worth mentioning. Differences in property tax bases can be huge. So let's say, for example, Saugatuck, a very property wealthy district, levies 1 mil in property tax. They generate a lot of money with that 1 mil. Compared to Escanaba, where we're not nearly as property wealthy, when we levy a mill, we recoup far less money. So for a taxpayer in Escanaba to contribute as much as a taxpayer in Saugatuck takes more mills and levy. And so there's an inequitable tax burden between communities, and that can make funding capital and facility needs tough. Now, having spoken generally about funding in Michigan, I want to speak specifically about Escanaba area public schools. We're a minimum foundation district, and what that means is that we receive the smallest amount of school funding from the state. So this school year, that is $8,111 per pupil. It's nice, but as we mentioned before, it's not really sufficient. 15 years ago, by comparison, the minimum foundation allowance was almost $7,000 per pupil. Now, if you took that amount and you simply increased it so that it kept pace with inflation, nothing really all that excessive, just trying to keep pace with inflation, the school would receive $9,038.50 per pupil today. And that's a difference of almost $1,000 per pupil. So to put it in perspective, if our state aid had just kept pace with inflation, we would receive an additional $2 million and change per year in funding. And that would be huge for us. Well, we don't have that, however. We do pay 2019 costs. Our costs continue to rise with inflation, but our funding hasn't. So we have far less money to pay for those inflation-adjusted costs. Now, our physical facilities are also older. They date back to a time during which efficiency and security weren't major concerns. So if you took a building like the upper elementary school, which was built in the 30s, you'll see that we have things like the big beautiful auditorium that was built not just for the school but also for the community, because schools were supposed to be inviting community in. And in the age of school shootings and security concerns, that's no longer the case. So retrofitting a building like the upper elementary can be very costly. It just wasn't designed for the type of safety that we need today. So we spend more money trying to make it safe. The average age of our facilities is 65 years old, which means the burden of repairing and upgrading our buildings is simply more costly. Trends in state funding, as we mentioned, and demographics, which we'll mention shortly in the Upper Peninsula, have combined to make the district's financial position a little more difficult. And then you have the fact that kids nationwide are entering schools with greater needs and not fewer. I spent much of my career as a high school principal, and when I began in that area a decade ago, behaviors that shocked me out of a high school student are behaviors that we're starting to see now in kids as young as first or second grade. And again, it's not just an Escanaba thing, it's everywhere that that's happening. And when you have kids like that coming in with that level of need, it's simply more expensive because you have to have more and more specialized staff members working with those students. And so we're also having to meet those needs as well with the funding that we have. Well, how have we tried as a district to respond proactively to these needs? The first thing we did was we put out 2 sinking fund proposals to help us address the security improvements, repairs, and upgrades that we need to make to our buildings, and both proposals failed. Well, I can't fault the voters. It is what it is, and we're a democracy. We're using the public's tax money, and the public should have a say in whether or not we can do that, and the answer was no. Well, it just means that now we have to find other ways to fund those capital expenses and try to do it without diverting money from the classrooms. That's a challenge, but it's one that we're trying to take on, and consolidation is part of that discussion. Well, in the absence of a sinking fund, I made some recommendations to the board so that we could increase our efficiency, which means doing more with what we have, and then also try to generate some funds, so increase our revenue in order to meet capital needs and other needs. So my first suggestion was that we investigate consolidation, because if we can do exactly what we're doing right now in fewer buildings, we save the cost of operating a building potentially, and we reduce duplication of services and staffing. We simply become more efficient. I recommend that we identify and sell unused or surplus properties. So you saw that last year we were able to sell the Wells campus to the YMCA, which was a big win on all sides, because it will still be used for an educational purpose and one that will benefit the community as a whole. And the district was able to get a fair price for that. I recommended we provide better stewardship over facilities and generate some revenue from building usage by increasing internal controls, updating our policies, and adjusting rental rates. That wasn't without a little controversy. However, our rental rates hadn't been adjusted since 1976, and it was time to make those rates a little more fair. And so we did raise them. We didn't adjust them for inflation. They'd actually be quite higher if we had just adjusted them for inflation. But we're hoping that the relatively smaller raises in rates that we made will help generate some revenue to help us take care of our buildings. And then I recommended we set aside fund balance over 5% after our December 1st amendment of the budget for capital needs. So kind of creating an emergency savings fund in case we ever need to tap. I want to talk a little bit about demographic trends now, because they have impacted the district pretty seriously. So we're going to take a look at a few of those. First, the demographics of the district and the Upper Peninsula in general have been difficult when it comes to student enrollments. If you look at the past 15 years and you study out the population in the ISD, you'll see that the student population has declined by 20%. And during that same period, the student population declined by 25% in the Escanaba area public schools. If you look at historical enrollment in the district, you look at 19 and 20, and we're a little over 2,300 kids. You look back to 2004, 2005, we were almost 3,000 kids. So that's a fairly significant loss in 15 years, and a lot of campuses have been closed over that time, and even before that time. If you look at the far right-hand column, the increase and decrease in students, you'll see that we've seen some pretty significant decreases year over year. We interrupted that trend last year with some of the new programming that we put in place, including the kindergarten center and the early middle college, and we have interrupted the massive losses that we had been seeing and took it down to really just a few students overall. So, a pretty significant trend there, one that's very hard to ignore. If we break it down by building, in 1920 you can look at what the building sizes are, and you can kind of scoot back to 2005, 2006 and see what they were then. It's kind of difficult to make this comparison because of campuses that have closed or been repurposed like Webster, and students that might have flowed in between them. But on the whole, you see the trend continue. We start out with more kids 15 years ago, and we have significantly less today. And then this is just for reference. What this tells you is the number of sections that we offer per grade level. You can think of it, if you want to simplify it, just the number of classrooms for that particular grade level. Really I'm just putting this out here so you have some idea of what those numbers are. We talked about the past. It's important that we talk about what the future demographic projections are. Because when you talk about closing schools, one of the things that people always worry about is, what's going to happen if we have this unexpected influx in students? We've closed a campus, and now what are we going to do about it? This will help answer some of those questions. This is a projection for Michigan overall, and it's from a fellow by the name of Frederick Ignatovich. This is one of the people that provides our 5-year projections as a district. This is his projection for Michigan. The company we use is Stanford, and it literally is run by a guy named Stan and a guy named Fred. This is the Fred half of that, providing that data. So if you look at Michigan overall, he is estimating a K-12 decline of about 4%. It's not evenly distributed between the grade levels though. K-5 is looking like about a 1% decline. 6-8 is big, almost an 8% decline. And then 9-12, just about a 5% decline. So overall, for the next 5 years, it's just continuing to look like decline, decline, decline. Then if we look at Delta County, I took this information straight from the state demographer's report, and it's a recent report, I think 2017 or 2018. And this is going to show us what the projected trends are in Delta County over the next 25 or so years. This one has 2 dotted lines in the forecast. You can ignore the zero net migration line because that's not reality anyway. We'll talk about migration in a minute. The dark green line is the realistic line, and if you look at population, you'll see that overall the trend is the same. I've used the word quite a bit, but it's looking like more decline in population within our county. This is a very interesting graph. It graphs births and deaths, and you'll see from the 70s right on up through about the mid-90s, births outpaced deaths. And typically when that happens, you have population growth. Now you'll see that they haven't always outpaced deaths to the same extent. In fact, as you get into the 2000s, those lines kind of mingle. But then look at that forecast out to 2045. It's almost the opposite. And when you have deaths outpacing births, you have declining population. But not only that, you can see how the number of births are declining. That's really significant for schools because that tells us that there's going to be an impact on the number of school-age children that are born and going to be entering our districts. So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to forecast any growth based on what we're seeing here. Now we get to the migration thing. If you have more deaths than births, the only way to keep your population steady or to grow it is to have people moving in. So if you have positive net migration, you have people moving in. Negative net migration, you have people moving out. And you'll see that our net migration over the past few years has been negative, more people moving out. That's a trend that we recognize. And it's not going to change all that much. We'll have slight positive net migration, but it's not going to be nearly enough to compensate for the decline in population in the county. So again, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to forecast any growth in student population based on what we're seeing with migration into the county. And all this combines to give us a negative population growth rate. Again, this isn't great news. It's negative, it kind of becomes slightly less negative, but it stays negative. Not much help coming here either, unfortunately. And here I have population pyramids, one for the year 2020, one forecast for the year 2030. You'll see the bulge there towards the top of the pyramids is largely in the group of people that were born and raised in Escanaba in the 60s and 70s. If you look by 2030, that bulge has moved upwards a little bit and slimmed down, unfortunately, because of mortality. But if you compare both of these pyramids, you'll see that the pyramid in 2030 is a little slimmer. One thing I'd point out to you is if you look at the pyramid between the ages of 15 and 19 and 20 and 24, you'll see a difficult trend there. It looks like, and we know this is happening, when kids graduate high school, they leave. They're moving for college, they're moving for opportunity, but they're not really coming back. You can see that in the pyramids, and it means that the population of adults that is of prime childbearing and child-rearing age slims down significantly in Delta County. And again, that's something we as schools pay close attention to because it means that we're not going to see the population increase in school-age children that we would if these people stayed here and had and raised their families. And finally, a graph of the predicted population of school-aged children. This looks like a big downward trend, and it is, but keep in mind the scale, right? This is about 6,000 kids that we're looking at here that we're going to go down over the next 25 years. But a fairly steep decline within the next 5 years, 200 kids. And in a county, that's a big deal. That's going to be a tough loss. We plateau for a little while, and then we see another probably fairly significant decline between 2040 and 2045. So again, not a trend that's favorable to growth. So we get to question one and we ask ourselves, based on what we've studied out here, is there a need to consolidate? Well, I believe the answer to that is yes. When you look at the realities of school funding, our district infrastructure needs, and the demographic trends, there's just a need to do more with what we have, to be more efficient. And consolidation will help us create a more efficient and stable district over the next 5 to 10 year period, which is about the period of time that a board should be thinking in. And if we do this, then the district will be able to invest more money into services, programs, and capital needs in fewer buildings, just meaning that we are actually doing more with what we have. So there is a need to consolidate. Well, if there's a need to consolidate, we need to talk about what the consolidation options are. So I'm going to run through the two that I presented to the board. Our first option was to close the upper elementary, and that would involve moving 6th grade to the junior high school and distributing grades 1 through 5 between Lummer and Sioux Hill. So the pros here would be that we reduce usage in our most expensive building, which is the upper elementary. We might be able to put off some of the maintenance that we see coming in the form of roofs, some leaking windows, some other things, maybe. We would keep elementary schools at different ends of the district, although it's worth noting that our population is not evenly distributed throughout the district. We would maximize building use at our elementary schools, maybe a little bit too much, we'll see. And it could be that other organizations will be interested in leasing space in the upper elementary if the school closes. That would produce some revenue in addition to providing some savings. We also limit transitions for groups of students, so there would be one less transition between schools than we currently have right now. We could also keep the auditorium and gym functional and available for school use or community use when needed. That's a possibility. There are some negatives to closing the upper elementary. One of the big negatives is that our technology department is located in the upper elementary building. And we have significant infrastructure that would take a lot of time and a lot of money to move. We also wouldn't have a location for our central office, which is small, but still housed in the upper elementary. So it means there are portions of the building we would have to continue to heat. If we continue to use the upper elementary, then it's not likely we'd be able to put off any of the maintenance that could become urgent in the building. There's the fact that enrollments on other campuses won't leave a lot of room for anything but classroom instruction. So you would see things like music and art on carts, a lot of special education happening in the regular classroom where it's not right now. We could lease portables or have modular spaces to help with that, but then that eats at your savings. Our building enrollments wouldn't leave a lot of room for unexpected growth. I'm not talking explosive growth there, however. Sometimes you get 5 to 10 kids that you didn't think were going to be there, and it means you have to open up a new classroom. There wouldn't be much room for that if we use this configuration. And then we would have to move boundaries on a pretty frequent basis in order to keep populations relatively balanced between Lemmer and Sioux Hill. So for example, if there were 26 kids in a third grade classroom at Lemmer and 24 in a third grade classroom at Sioux Hill, there's a strong possibility that one kid that would normally be going to Lemmer would have to bus out to Sioux Hill. So those boundaries would be changing very, very frequently. Collaboration is a little more difficult because you have the grade levels split between two buildings like we have them right now for first, second, and third grade. You'd also have kids together in kindergarten, begindergarten. You'd separate them out for grades 1 through 5, and then you'd have them together again for grades 6 through 12. These are the important numbers. This gives you some idea of what the student enrollments in each of those buildings would be next year if we went with this configuration option. 15 years ago, Lemmer Elementary was, I think, at about 411 or so students. Next year it would be at 444 students if we did this. Sioux Hill, I think, in the past 15 years was max 358 or so students. They'd be at 351 next year. So really no space for anything but kids in classrooms, art, music on carts, that kind of thing. Very, very stuffed buildings. The junior high school and the high school, not as much impact. If we move 6th grade to the junior high school, they'd be at about 480 kids. Next year, 700 kids in the high school. That really is only about 20 more students than were there when the junior high first moved over to the high school campus. So looks like at that level anyway, there would be plenty of room. Now our second consolidation option is to close Sioux Hill. And this would involve moving grades 1 and 2 to Lemmer, grades 3 through 5 at the upper elementary, and moving grade 6 to the junior high school. And I have to note this is a slight modification from my original option 2 proposal because my original proposal didn't include moving 6th grade to the junior high school. But when we realized how easy it would be to make that move, we decided to integrate it into this option. So the pros here are that we improve our building usage and we leave plenty of room for current numbers of students. In some cases, our buildings would actually be a little less crowded than they are right now. It allows for full grade level teams and stronger collaboration. So with all the first grade and second grade teachers on one campus, a lot of collaboration that can happen between them. And we've seen the benefits of that at the kindergarten center. We'd like to scale that up. Students move all together in single cohort groups. They're never separated out. It's much easier to balance classes. So if you think back about the scenario where there are 26 kids in a third grade classroom at Lemmer, 24 in a third grade classroom at Sioux Hill, now we may have to bus a kid. That doesn't happen when all the grade levels are together on one campus. We can balance those classes lickety-split, very easy. And we still have dedicated rooms for special education staff, for art, music, itinerants if we close Sioux Hill. Plenty of room for that. The ISD, I don't think this is a big secret, so I'm speaking about it openly, is interested in purchasing Sioux Hill for the Learning Center if we close that campus. That means that Sioux Hill would continue to be used for an educational purpose and one that would benefit us. Most of the Learning Center students are Escanaba students. So you'd have a campus that continues to serve an Escanaba population. And this scenario also allows room for unexpected growth. So if we get those 5 to 10 kids more than we thought we were going to get, we have to open a new classroom. We have space to do that with this configuration. There are some cons. You're still operating the upper elementary at that point, and so you're going to have to do some security upgrades, some repairs, things that could potentially be expensive. You might lose some outlying students who would attend or would otherwise attend Sioux Hill. And this option has one more transition from school to school than option 1 does, but it is equal to the current number of transitions that students experience between schools in our district. So no real change in the number of transitions from what we have right now. Here are what the student enrollment numbers would look like. Lemmer would actually be a little smaller next year with about 321 kids. The upper elementary would be slightly larger, but not much, with 442 kids. The junior high and high school, as we mentioned earlier, if we move 6th grade up, not really much of an impact. You have about 20 more students than you had when you first moved the junior high school up to the high school. So we hit question number 2, which is, can we provide the same programs and level of service in fewer buildings? Well, if we look at option 1, which is closing the upper elementary, then no, we can't. Our classrooms would be so full and our buildings would be so full that we wouldn't be able to provide programming in the same way. Plus, you have things like the location of the tech department, central office, that might also eat into savings we could see from closing the upper elementary. So, not really an option. Option 2, however, closing Sioux Hill would allow the district to maintain current levels of service and programming, and in many cases with room to spare. So this does appear to be a viable consolidation option. Well, what would the impact of closing Sioux Hill and reconfiguring be? A conservative estimate, I think, of the minimum savings from closing Sioux Hill would be about $200,000. And that would come, I have listed out here, in the form of a principal, probably a secretary, and utility costs. There's some other costs I haven't factored into this, things like maintenance that are really kind of hard to figure, so we didn't do that, but that would add to the savings that we see here. If Sioux Hill is closed, our room usage at Lemmer in the upper elementary would remain roughly the same. I might recommend a few changes at the upper elementary, however, and I'll show you that in just a second. We would also need to identify 5 to 6 new classrooms at the junior high school for our 6th grade to go into. So let's see what that would look like. At the upper elementary, I've got circled in red here room 135. If you have attended a board meeting, you might have come in this door. It is a room that is sort of half classroom, half home economics lab space. The reality is, I don't think the state is ever going to be promoting home economics based education anymore. Universities have stopped their certification programs. We don't have the funding to pay for that even if we wanted to. So I think we're really best served by considering taking this room and taking the home ec portion of it out and splitting it into 2 classrooms that we could use if we needed to. The band room, which is circled in orange, could also be converted if 6th grade moves up to the junior high campus where they would be doing band on a different campus. I think we have plenty of room without doing that, but I think those are 2 nice changes we might want to make. Now, looking at the junior high and high school campus, if we do this, I think it's important that we continue to have 6th, 7th, and 8th grade separated out into their own wing. And so the big question is, could you do that? Well, the A wing that I have here is the junior high wing. And in green, I have circled classrooms that are either not being currently used or are being used right now for purposes that are not classroom purposes. So for a lounge, for storage, in one instance for the robotics program, which is a pretty valuable program, That might have to change locations, but the bottom line is we have 4 classrooms that we could turn into instructional classrooms tomorrow if we needed to. Then I have some rooms circled in red. 2 computer labs. These are hardwired computer labs that the district is no longer going to maintain no matter what we decide right now. With the low cost of Chromebooks and the fact that Chromebooks can do everything our hardwired labs can do, it's just not economically feasible to keep those labs. So they will go away. Both those spaces could be used as classroom spaces. In addition, we have those 2 small rooms on the end, 219 and 218. If you look right beside them, you got room 214. That's Mr. Wilson's room. So if you've been in there, you can kind of picture it. It's a big, nice, spacious room. 219 and 218 mirror that room. It's just a cinder block wall was put up to divide them into 2 smaller classrooms back when work was done after the bond on the high school. I'd advise we simply knock that wall down and turn that back into a nice big spacious classroom. Because if you swing back over to the A wing, I have 2 rooms circled in blue. Those are 2 staff members who teach primarily high school classes. One of those staff members could move to that new big room. One of those staff members could move to one of those soon-to-be empty computer labs. And we would have easily, by the start of the school year next year, 6 classrooms in the junior high wing that could be dedicated to 6th grade without any impact at all on 7th or 8th grade. So we could house all of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade in the wing where the junior high is currently housed, and we could maintain the separation that we have between the junior high and the high school population. Actually, it would be very easy to do. So some changes that I would recommend we make there. And so we get to question number 3. Should we consolidate, and if so, how and when? Well, let's answer that. We should consolidate. If you just look at our circumstances, there's a need for more efficiency in our district configuration, and we need to set the district up for some stability over the next 5 to 10 year period. We can absolutely provide the same level of service and programming we do today in fewer buildings. In other words, we can absolutely be more efficient than we are right now. And given those 2 things, my recommendation is that we close Sioux Hill Elementary effective the 2020-2021 school year. And we do that by moving all of grades 1 and 2 to Lemmer, move all of grades 3 through 5, really just grade 3, to the upper elementary, and then move grade 6 to the junior high school campus. So there's some additional considerations here because, as a board, we've been talking about this for almost a year now in open meetings. We haven't really made any secret of the fact that we are investigating consolidation. Given that, I've had some people talk to me about some concerns that they have, and I want to address a few of those here right now. The first set of concerns are grade level concerns. So people sometimes worry about the idea of having 6th graders on a junior high school campus. Well, the 612 secondary configuration is very, very common. It's more common than what we have right now, as a matter of fact. So having 6th through 12th grades together is kind of normal, to tell you the truth. My first job as a high school principal was on a 612 secondary campus. And I know everybody worries about issues between the junior high kids and the high school kids. The reality is that doesn't happen. It's kids of the same age who have issues with each other. And those issues, they would occur no matter what campus the kids were on. So you don't see any additional issues between the grades simply because of moves like we're proposing here. And then there's the fact that we can entirely house grades 6 through 8 in the A wing, so we maintain that distinction between junior high and high school. I'm also recommending we move away from our current self-contained model where 6th graders are only seeing a few teachers. And I'm recommending we go to a model that's more like what we follow for 7th and 8th grade, where a student goes to an English certified teacher to have their English curriculum delivered to them, where they're taught math by a math certified teacher. I think that's more beneficial for a sixth grade learner. We need to take a couple of years to do that because the certification requirements are different between self-contained and non-self-contained sixth grade. So we would take some time to get the right people in the right places and to allow anybody who wants to stay in sixth grade and who doesn't yet have the right certification to teach outside of a self-contained sixth grade to change their certification. Also, some concerns about third graders on the upper elementary campus. This changes a bit, I think, if we take sixth grade off of the upper elementary campus. But I do want to reassure people that the upper elementary can accommodate third graders. We can put them all together on the first floor. And the restrooms we have are also appropriate for third grade age and size students. There have been a few logistical concerns. One of these has been start times because you would move potentially third graders to a 7:30 start time, and that's been concerning to some folks who feel like that's too early. And so I wanted to touch a little bit on the research on start times. It's not a solid body of research yet. It's really kind of just started, but the general consensus I could sum up this way. It would be better all around if schools started later. However, if you do start anybody later, it should be the teenagers, not the younger kids. I know that that kind of flies in the face of the way things have always been done, but the truth is, if you're going to start anybody early, it's better to start the younger kids early. So there's really no physiological reason for third graders not to start at 7:30. However, I do understand that there are concerns, and I don't want to be dismissive of those concerns. So I'm suggesting as potential courses of action, a survey. And let's see what our school community thinks about changing start times. And if there's interest, then we could form a committee to study it out and make a recommendation. There's some things that complicate changing start times. A lot of these are driven by secondary level activities in athletics, fine arts, and after school programs. But you also have some issues with the district having to do 2 bus runs because of our size. So we have to go out, pick up a group of kids, bring them in, drop them off, go out, pick up another group of kids, bring them in, drop them off, and then we do the opposite at the end of the school day in 2 bus runs. That's just a logistical need, and it means that we have to have staggered start times because we have to leave time for the buses then to go out and get that second group of kids. So that's a complicating factor there, but not one that couldn't potentially be overcome if we had a good out-of-the-box idea. Other logistical issues that might arise are probably best addressed at the campus level, which is why I think this decision should be made sooner rather than later so that we can get started on planning for those things. And just a last note on busing. The reconfiguration we think is probably actually going to make us a little bit more efficient because when you take a campus out of the picture, it streamlines routes. It hopefully makes them a little quicker, and we might save some money. I don't know, it's hard to say, but overall, I think it will make us more efficient in our busing. I think it will be beneficial. Now, the elephant in the room. If you close Sioux Hill, will you lose a bunch of students? I think that the way we address that issue is first by emphasizing what we have here in Escanaba that makes us different from other districts. And I think there are very compelling reasons to stay in the district. Some of those reasons could be, for example, the programs we offer and the ages at which we offer them. You can't go anywhere else and get orchestra, and you certainly can't go anywhere else and get orchestra if you're a sixth grader. You can't, get band as a sixth grader. We start a lot of those things very early, and it's very beneficial for students. We have programs that other districts our size don't normally offer because we commit so much funding to the classroom. Even as we have shrunk in population and finances have got difficult, we've always tried to maintain the wealth of programming that we have. And I think you give that up if you leave Escanaba. There are other reasons too. If you look at the graduation side of things, our college readiness scores as a district are well above what anybody else around us has. Our SAT scores are well above what anybody else around us has. We offer AP, we offer an early middle college program. Any kid that comes out of Escanaba is going to be much better prepared for their post-secondary endeavors than students who are coming out of other districts. And I think that's a compelling reason to stay in the district. It speaks very highly to the quality of education that we provide. And there are scholarships. We gave out almost $500,000 in scholarships to the senior class last year. Nobody else around us can really even come close to matching that. And one of the things I will recommend that the board do in conjunction with consolidation, if they opt to go that route, is to make some policy changes to ensure that that funding flows to students who have been loyal to Escanaba. I think students and families who have chosen to stay here should be the primary beneficiaries of things like scholarships. So I would anticipate potentially giving that up too if folks leave the district. In any case, as we make this decision, what role should the potential for student loss play in making the decision? I guess first off, I'd say that if Sioux Hill isn't closed now, it's not going to end that discussion. The financial trends, the demographic trends, the gradual student loss means that we're always going to be talking about closing a campus if we don't do it now. Those populations will get smaller and smaller. Really, the only alternative is to take students who live closer to, say, for example, Lemmer, and start busing them out to supplement the Sioux Hill student population, which to some degree is actually happening right now. About a quarter of the Sioux Hill population does live in Escanaba proper. But that I don't think is a good or efficient alternative. So I think of it in terms of what we know. We know for certain that reconfiguration will save the district money and make it more efficient. What we don't know is what the loss of students will be and whether any potential loss will offset funds saved through reconfiguration. I put the tipping point at 30 plus or minus 5 students. So the savings could be a wash if we lose between 25 and 35 students as a result of the reconfiguration. But I would add that even then, because of the reconfiguration, because we now have all of a grade level on a particular campus, we can easily and immediately right size, which is something that we have difficulty doing in our current configuration. So even if we did see student loss of 30 students, which I don't believe we would, very easy to right size and adjust for that now and set ourselves up for the next 5 to 10 years. So here's how I'd sum it up. The known benefits of reconfiguring outweigh the known consequences of maintaining our current configuration. We're spending money that we don't necessarily have to. The known benefits of reconfiguring also outweigh the potential drawbacks of reconfiguring. And given those two things, my recommendation then is to reconfigure. If you were at our meeting on Monday, you heard that we got a very good audit report back. We have been conservative in our budgeting. We've tried to be efficient in many other areas, and we spent about $680,000 less last year, and we will recoup that savings. We also saw fewer students leave the district than we budgeted for. We budgeted for a loss of about 50 students. We ended up only losing about 15. So we have 35 more students than we budgeted for, and we received funding, unexpected funding, for each of those students. And we received $60 more per pupil than we budgeted for from the governor and the legislature in the budgets that they signed. The bottom line here is that we'll have a little over $1 million that we didn't anticipate having, and so I anticipate some people will say, well, geez, if you have $1 million more than you thought you were going to have, why would you close a campus? So we have to think of that in terms of two different types of cost. In a school district, we have legacy costs, and legacy costs are costs that occur year after year after year. So if we give a raise to employees, we don't take the raise away the next year, and so the cost of that raise hits us every year after we give the raise. That's a legacy cost. A one-time cost would be something like buying a computer card. Once you've bought it, you got it. There isn't a recurring cost with that. It's a one-time cost. You have to think about money the same way. Some of the funding you get, you can count on receiving year over year. So that $240 per pupil increase that the governor and the legislature signed into law for us this year will probably be there next year and the year after and the year after. So that's legacy revenue, if you want to think about it that way. But most of the $1 million we're going to see this year that we didn't anticipate having is one-time funds. The money that comes back after the audit, that's only a this year thing. We don't know that the same thing will happen next year. The same with having more students than we budgeted for. We don't know if that's going to happen next year. So those are one-time revenues. As a district, you have to be very careful not to get into legacy costs using one-time revenues, because what happens is you burn through those one-time revenues and you end up making cuts afterwards because you've committed to something you can't sustain. And we can't sustain keeping a building open on the extra money that we got that we didn't anticipate getting this year, because most of it is one-time funding. So we have to be careful of that. One-time funding needs to be spent on one-time costs, and legacy funding should be judiciously spent on legacy costs. So what then would we do with Sioux Hill Elementary? As I mentioned earlier, the ISD is interested in purchasing it for use for the Learning Center, and I've recommended to the board that we give the ISD right of first refusal. If they move the Learning Center to Sioux Hill, it continues to be used as an educational facility serving a majority Escanaba student population. And I'd recommend we obtain an appraisal and use that as a starting point for negotiating a sale price. Absent an agreement with the ISD, I'd recommend we sell the building to the highest bidder as expeditiously as possible so we don't have the recurring maintenance and upkeep costs of maintaining a closed building. So some final thoughts, and it's important that I say this. I want to make sure that everybody understands that this recommendation is in no way, shape, or form a commentary on the great work and dedication of Sioux Hill staff, students, and community. I want to recognize the good things that are going on out there. I want to recognize the investment that people have in that building. It's significant, and my recommendation is in no way meant to diminish that. I want to be very, very, very clear about that. But I also want people to understand that there is a big picture here. And the big picture is the district has to use its resources efficiently, and we have to set ourselves up for stability over the next 5 to 10 years. And we have to be very rational and think things through very thoroughly when we do that. And one of the reasons this has been a long presentation is that I have tried to present the data and the finances and the trends that I feel provide compelling reasons for consolidating and closing Sioux Hill Elementary School. You know, I understand that for a lot of people, closing a school is an emotional thing, and I don't want to diminish that either. People get attached to their school buildings, in particular kind of a community school building, and that's important. It's significant, and again, I don't want to diminish it, but as a district, I think we owe it to our taxpayers and to the people who fund us to, in the big picture, be as efficient as we possibly can. So I understand this is a risk, but I feel it's a risk worth taking. In the time that I've been here, we have taken some big risks. When we opted to reconfigure Webster so that it became a kindergarten center, we heard a lot of the same concerns that we're hearing right now with the closure of Sioux Hill. People told us that folks would flee the district in droves if they had to send their kids to a kindergarten center at Webster for their kindergarten education. People were worried about the transition from the kindergarten center into first grade. When we said we were going to redo the playground and change some of the things in the building to make it more accommodating to kindergarten students, people told us we couldn't get it done. We felt it was a risk worth taking, and so we did. We know it would be the right thing for kids, and it all worked out. We figured that our max population there would be 195 kindergarten students, and in year 2 of operation, we're at over 230. We've had to add kindergarten sections to accommodate for that growth because spectacular things are happening on that campus with all of our kindergarten and kindergarten teachers being there together. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we want to scale that up, and I think that is a risk worth taking. I think kids in Escanaba will benefit from making this change. And so I've recommended that the board consider this as quickly as possible. Which takes us to timelines. So I've asked the board to send me any questions they have or any requests for additional data that they may have before the November Committee of the Whole meeting. I'd also like to collect that information from staff and parents as well and try to get everything we can answered during that November Committee of the Whole meeting. I've told the board I think our latest date by which we can decide on this recommendation is the December regular board meeting. That gives us time to plan. I think if we go out much beyond that, then we start to run up against some deadlines that we'd have to work really hard to meet. But I put it out there that if everybody gets their questions answered, there's nothing wrong with deciding during the November regular meeting. In fact, what I'm hearing from a lot of people, both staff and community, is that really earlier is better. If you're going to do it, just go ahead and do it so we can get things rolling and get things done so that we welcome kids back next year and continue to provide them a good education in Escanaba. So that about does it. If you started at the beginning and you made it all the way through to the end, kudos to you. I know these aren't always the most interesting presentations, but I hope that what I have put out there for you answers a lot of the questions that you have, and I hope it helps you understand why we're making the recommendation that we are. But if you have any questions, I would encourage you to contact me. I'm happy to speak over the phone. I'm also happy to meet face to face. And if we have one of those community meetings and you want to come and ask questions or provide feedback, well, we would certainly welcome that. So again, thank you for watching the presentation. Have a good day.